Hello, 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 all you lovely people. Professor Gray here with what is indeed the last module for unit number 5 on deontological approaches. I know, that means there is an exam due this weekend. Oh, no, I know. As usual, I'll post a short video along with the exam, but more on that when we get to that later on. For right now, though, let's wrap up unit number 5. Again, we've been looking at deontological approaches in this unit, and we've seen that deontological approaches are quite different from those teleological approaches. Remember that teleology, these approaches, the goodness of outcomes is the only thing with intrinsic moral value. Meanwhile, deontology says, well, no, there are other things with intrinsic moral value besides the goodness of outcomes. And as I've been saying, this is a really deep divide when it comes to normative ethics. I mean, recall normative ethics, it's all about stating and defending our basic moral principles. And so, yeah, we're having this debate here between teleology and deontology. And the debate is, should our moral principles be based only on the goodness of outcomes, or should there be other factors for, determining or shaping morality as well? And yeah, so that's a very deep question about our moral principles. What are they going to be based on? And that's a very important issue here in normative ethics that we're going through now. And so, of course, this all brings us back to the beast, Kant. Oh, Immanuel Kant, the stuff of nightmares, my nightmares, your nightmares. And as we've seen now in Kant, Kant is saying that you should do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. Full stop. That is it. You should do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. Or to put this into more, Kantian language, you should do your duty because it's your duty, not for any other reason. You should, as Kant says, when you do your duty because it's your duty, you are acting from duty, right? That's the Kantian language. You are acting from duty, or you're acting from a sense of duty, or you're acting for duty's sake, all those different ideas. But again, this all comes back to you're acting from duty. You're doing it because it's your duty. It's not enough, he says, right? All those examples he gave, it's not enough simply that you are conforming to duty. It's not enough that you're doing the right thing. You have to do it because it is your duty. You have to do it because it's the right thing to do. You shouldn't be doing it to produce any kind of outcomes. Because we saw, as Kant says right at the beginning of what we read last time, is that the outcomes of your actions, he says, this is pretty wow, the outcomes of your actions have no moral value whatsoever. And as he notes, anything that your actions can produce could be used for great evil if, so the outcomes of your actions, he says, has conditional value. That is, the value of your actions are conditional on them being done from a goodwill, done from duty, done because it is duty. And even then, this gets really wild, right? I mean, he really rejects teleology and goodness of outcomes because he says, even if you have a goodwill and for bad luck or whatever, you never produce a single good outcome, sometimes you have bad luck, right? But you had the goodwill, and that's all that matters. And so this is not teleology. This is not, this is deontology. There are other things that matter besides the goodness of outcomes here. And so, well, what is the goodwill? What is this goodwill that Kant is talking about? And Kant comes to the conclusion, right? This argument of you kind of laugh because he thinks this is a common sense argument about acting from duty. And well, the conclusion there just is right, that a goodwill acts from respect for the moral law. The goodwill does not act based on inclination, desire, or appetite. That's not what the goodwill is about. And so then, of course, this raised the question of what does it mean to respect the moral law? If that's what the goodwill needs to do, okay, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to respect, the moral law? And the respecting the moral law, according to Kant, means you're submitting yourself to it. You are willing. You are choosing. Willing is choosing for Kant, right? You are willing. You are choosing to obey the moral law. But you're choosing to obey it for the right reasons. Because again, Kant says you do not show respect for the moral law if you obey the moral law out of prudence, right? You're hoping for a reward or you're fearing a punishment. Kant says any of those desires, any of those inclinations, any of those appetites have no moral value whatsoever. You might conform to duty, you might conform to the moral law, but you're not doing it for the right reasons. Anything about those subjective desires, inclinations, bad, bad, bad. And so, of course, we saw, well, what's left then? How can I act from respect for the moral law, if that's what I'm supposed to be doing to have a good will, to be a moral person? And now Kant says, of course, that the respect for the moral law is found in the principle that you adopt, that you choose when acting. And remember, Kant says that whenever you choose to act, you're acting according to a principle, and Kant calls that principle your maxim, right? The subjective principle of willing. But that's what you're acting for. You're acting for a maxim. And recall, we can throw up the slide, we had the material of the maxim. That the material, involves what you are doing. That's the action. It also involves why are you doing it? That's the purpose. And then we see that the material comes together to give that general form of a maxim, which is, do the action for the sake of whatever that purpose is. And so now, of course, we're back to, so it's about maxims, and these maxims have to somehow display respect for the moral law. Fantastic. What does that mean, Mr. Kant? Can we just look at the action? We look at action A. That's, the first part of the maxim was what we're doing. And Kant says, no, that's not, can't look at the action, because as he said already, we could look at the action and you look like you're conforming with duty, but you could be doing it for the wrong reasons. And so, doing it for the wrong reasons is not respecting the moral law. Okay, fine. Well, let's look at the reasons for the maxim, right? That's the purpose. That's P, right? Because we're doing the action for the sake of something. Okay, well, that seems to be the reason we're doing it. So then let's look to there, and is that going to tell us whether or not we're, that purpose, is that going to tell us whether or not we're respecting the moral law? And Kant says again, no. Oh my gosh, Kant, you're killing me here. Because if we look at the purpose, Kant really does think we're probably going to keep coming up against desire, inclination, appetite. And he really does think that when we look at our maxims, there's often might be an incentive, he calls it, an incentive, something subjective that's incentivizing you to do it. Like, that sounds a lot like prudence, right? You're doing it to satisfy a desire, to meet an inclination, or to satisfy an appetite. And again, Kant has said repeatedly in the last module he says repeatedly that acting based on an incentive, and an incentive of inclination, desire, appetite, that again is not showing respect for the moral law. You're not doing it because it's the law. You're doing it, to satisfy some desire or something. And so the material of the maxim doesn't help. You look at the action, well, it could be the right action, but for the wrong reasons. Well, let's look at the reasons then. Well, every reason we look at seems to be conditional. It's not good in of itself, because it seems to always be going back to some kind of desire. And so we're like, oh crap, dude, what's left? It seems like actions alone don't show respect. Purposes alone don't seem to show respect. Well, how do we show respect then, dude? And Kant says, don't look to that material. Look to the form. We saw, right? He says he's robbed us of all that. All the material has been robbed from us. He says quite literally. And all that we're left with then is the form of a maxim. And so the form, of course, of the maxim, as we've seen, we can throw it back up there, is do A for the sake of P, do A for the sake of P. And so the idea we see here is what Kant says. When we look at that form, we need the action and the purpose, the A and the P. They need to harmonize in some way. The action and the purpose have to come together to have the right form. And then as long as your maxim can have that right form, you're the maxim, your principle, your choice, the action and the reason come together well, that will show respect. And so, of course, we're like, well, okay, smarty pants, Kanti, what do you got here for me? So what's the right form for my maxim? And Kant answers, he says, your maxim should have the same form as the moral law. That is, your maxim should be something that could become, at least in principle, part of the moral law. And so at the very least then to do that, your maxim must have the form, the same form as the moral law. And then, okay, well, what form does the moral law have? And well, Kant thinks the moral law, like any good law, has the most obvious of forms. The form is universality. It is universal. That is to say, the moral law, or like any good law, is a law that's something, a good law is something that all rational beings can follow without exceptions. That's universal. That's what he says. The form of a good law is universal. So if your maxim does that, then you got a good maxim. And if your maxim can be universalized, well, hell, let's throw it up. There it is. This is known as the formula of universal law. Act only according to that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So again, you're respecting the law, the moral law, when you are acting upon a principle, a maxim, that is one that you could submit to as if it were a moral law, and a moral law will at the very least have the form of universality. And so again, that's what you're doing. You're just checking your maxims and seeing, could these be something like a moral law? Well, at the very least, then it has to be, again, the very least, it has to be something universalizable. And Kant says if you can do that, you're looking pretty good. And again, this is a very formal idea, obviously, literally formal, because it doesn't tell us much about the contents of our maxims. It's just saying what form our maxims must have. Again, our maxims must have the same form as your maxims must have the same form as the moral law, which is something, of course, universal because it's a good law. And then something then, of course, it's universal when all rational beings could follow it without exception. But look, it still does some work for us, Kant says. This isn't like empty. I mean, for instance, we could throw this up here. Suppose I make a sincere promise to you, maybe I want to borrow some money from you, but I'm in a bit of trouble. Maybe I bet on the presidential race and I lost. Oh man, what was I thinking making that bet? Now I have to pay the debt. I bet wrong. I have to pay the debt. And so I ask you, hey, student of mine, your professor has some gambling debts. Could I borrow a quick $50? That's how sad it is. I need $50. I'm that poor. Could I borrow a quick $50 from you? I'll pay you back, I promise. And I mean it. I'm not lying to you. I will absolutely pay you back that $50 once I have it. And so, yeah, I've made a promise to pay you back because I want to get out of trouble. And Kant would say, I don't think there's anything wrong with this maxim. I mean, the maxim, look, we can put it there. It says, the maxim says, do make a sincere promise for the sake of avoiding some trouble. And I don't think Kant would say there's anything that seems to be universalizable. All rational beings could obey that, make a promise to get yourself out of trouble. Seems like an okay law. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to give me the money, but my promise is at least sincere. But meanwhile, we have the example we talked about in the last module, the false promise example, right? We can look at that. Again, I'm asking to borrow some money from you, and I promise to pay you back, but it's a false promise because I know I will never pay you back that $50. Now, we can look at the maxim there that Kant has us consider. Do make a false promise for the sake of avoiding some trouble. Now, Kant says you cannot make that into a universal law. And I mentioned this in the last video, and it's going to come up again, so I want to say it again. The problem here with that maxim, do make a false promise for the sake of getting out of trouble. Kant says that entails a practical contradiction. A practical contradiction. That is, if we try to make that maxim a universal law, that means then everyone is allowed to lie if it gets them out of trouble. But once that becomes a universal law, there's a contradiction because now my action, the false promise, comes into contradiction with my purpose of avoiding trouble. Again, my action and my purpose come into contradiction. They no longer harmonize once that becomes a universal law. Well, why does it create a contradiction? Because now my action of lying will no longer serve my purpose of helping me. Originally, I'm lying, so it helps me, but now it won't. Why won't it help me? Because no one will ever believe my lie. The minute that maxim becomes a universal law, anytime anyone says, I promise, we'll just laugh at them and be like, yeah, we're not a sucker. We're not falling for that again, right? And so if I promise, if I lie, I don't get out of trouble, I'm still in trouble because my lie won't work. You'll laugh and walk away. And that's the practical contradiction. If you try to make the maximum a universal law, there's no harmony now between the action and the purpose because the action will literally no longer serve the purpose. The lie will not get me what I want because no one will ever believe the lie. And so again, Kant says, you want the universal law for honesty. That sounds great. But then, of course, if I tell the lie, I want to be the exception, right? I want to get away with it. I want to cheat. But the only way then lying works is if I break the law, if I make myself the exception. And of course, breaking a law, being the exception, is not respecting the moral law anymore. Okay, that's a long review. But sometimes it's good to see things a few times in slightly different ways. It's just, this idea is so important. But I think, maybe that second run through I just did, hopefully that helps a little bit for it to make a little more sense. All right, anyhow, new material for this module now. So what we want to do in this module is we want to go beyond this mere formal idea of, making a maxim, a universal law like morality is. And so instead what we see in this module now, this is cool. It's actually one of my favorite modules. It's tough, but man, this is where I think you start to see why Kant's a genius. The last module, this formal stuff, sadly, that's what most people remember. It's the least interesting. This stuff, because what he's trying to do is be substantive now. He really wants to tell us what the moral law means. So far, we've only seen what form the moral law has, something universal. that all rational beings can do. But what does that mean? What's going on there? What's substantive about this? I don't want just the form. I want to know, what does it mean to obey and follow the moral law? And in fleshing out this meaning of the moral law, Kant is going to explain how the moral law is about respect, about respecting each other. And so what Kant is going to tell us now is how we ought to respect each other and why we ought to respect each other. And Kant's going to say, you are owed respect by your very nature as a rational being. You are a rational being and you are owed respect. And indeed, we're going to see a very familiar idea here about that you, as we've seen now a lot in this course, you have the capacity to act on rational plans and lead a structured life. That's your capacity as a rational being, to lead a structured life. So very important, and that's why you're going to be owed respect at the end. And so we'll go through this now. So then first we'll see how Kant understands the human will, which is seen by comparing our human will with the will of animals and with the will of divinity. It's pretty cool. Second, Kant is curious about is it possible, or how is it possible for a human will to obey commands? If we have a free will, how can we possibly obey a command? We're free. And so we'll see this in a discussion on the imperatives for a free will. And third and finally, we'll see how Kant draws all this together in his argument for respecting our rational natures. So that's it. That's the module. By the end of this, I hope we make it through Kant in one piece. We can buy t-shirts or something. I don't know. Say we did it. We can't even. But before we get to any of that, let's take our first quick break, and then we'll come back and get started.